And then the three of them set out, galloping through the forest, back towards their kingdom and their father, who was lying on a bed of pain, very ill. And they rode for a short time, or they rode for a long time. For time is a rope that winds in mysterious ways. But before long, they saw smoke in the air. Before long, they came to a ditch, and there was a dead horse in that ditch. Before long, they heard crying and shouting and sorrowing all around them. Before long, they came to a burned house and a burned wagon. And they arrived in a kingdom filled with trouble. A kingdom where everyone was either starving or fighting or grieving some great loss. And they made their way across the muddy, ruined ground to a castle at the center of that realm. And there was a king and there was a queen there. And they spent the night with those two royal personages. And the king and the queen poured out their sorrows and told them about all the troubles that had beset their kingdom. How a serious drought had made the crops fail, how these people were fighting these people. They described to them all the chaos of their realm. And then the youngest son said, "Well, I have this sword, which I am told can defeat entire armies. And I have this bread, which I am told will feed any number of people without running out. If you wish to use these things to bring harmony to your kingdom, please do so." Well, the king accepted these gifts. He took the sword, and he brought harmony to his kingdom. And his wife, the queen, she took the magic loaf of bread, and she fed the people of that kingdom. So working together, the king and queen made that kingdom once again a place of harmony and deep contentment. And then they returned these gifts to the youngest son, and they said, "We are too poor and too broken to give you anything at all, except for our thanks. You have our deep thanks. We will not forget you." And the three brothers rode away from that kingdom and across the forests and wild places of this earth. Well, they traveled for a short time or a long time, for 3 days or 3 months. And again, they came to a kingdom that was filled with trouble. Again, they came to a place where the people were starving and there was fighting in the streets. They saw houses on fire. They saw dead horses, wagons turned over, fields filled with nothing but stubble. And again, they came to the castle of that realm. Again, they spoke with the king and queen. And again, the youngest son loaned the magic sword and the magic bread to these royal people. And they used them to bring harmony and contentment to their kingdom. And when it was all over, they said, "We have no gifts to give you, but we give you our thanks. We will not forget what you have done." And the three brothers rode off across the earth. Now there are rhythms in this life. Rhythms, there are patterns. There are rhythms like the beat of a drum, like a heartbeat, like the crashing of waves on the sea. And stories speak in these rhythms. And stories have things to tell us. Sometimes they insist upon certain things. As a stone insists on being in a particular place. As a tree insists on leafing out every spring. As a bird insists on singing its song. And so this story insists upon these kingdoms. For in fact, they then came to a third kingdom filled with trouble. And if you ask how much trouble is in this story, the story would say there are 3 kingdoms worth of trouble in this story. If you were going to bake or cook up this story, you need 3 kingdoms worth of trouble. That is one of the ingredients. That is how much suffering is in this story. And in this kingdom, the youngest son was able to help as well. And again, he loaned the king and the queen the magic sword and the magic bread. And again, because of these magical gifts, contentment and harmony were brought to that kingdom. "We will remember you," the king and queen said, as they stood at the gate of their castle, waving goodbye. And the three brothers rode, galloping, out into the forests of this world. And they galloped for a good long time, until finally they came to a great ocean, laughing and collapsing and crashing. That ocean was mighty and it was blue, and they could not see the other side. So the three of them went to a harbor, and they booked passage on a boat sailing across that ocean. And you may ask, why is there an ocean? Well, the story needs an ocean now. There is more water in the story now. There is more of that changing, mirror-like, always laughing and grieving, sorrowing water in this story now. And they got on this boat, and it sailed across the sea. And it was such a long journey that they had to sleep. But one of them slept before the others, and this was the youngest son. He slept in a hammock below the decks there. And as he slept, his two brothers muttered and snickered among themselves. And then they came to the place where the youngest brother slept. And the oldest reached with his hand into the cloak that the youngest son wore. And he was careful not to awaken him, though the youngest son murmured a little bit. And the eldest brother reached far in and took hold of the glass vial containing the water of life. And slowly he pulled it out. And then he took that magic water of life, and he poured it into a vial of his own. And he put seawater inside the vial in the cloak of the youngest son. And he put a cork on it, and he reached carefully back into that cloak. And he put it back in the pocket of that cloak, and gently, slowly pulled his hand away. And the youngest son did not awake. And then, laughing to themselves, the two older brothers also slept. And that boat sailed across the salt sea, until they came to the other shore, where seagulls were crying in the air, and where there was a harbor, and people were welcoming travelers home. They got off that boat, and they got on their horses, and they rode back to the castle, which was not far. There they were, back in their own kingdom. And the people of that kingdom were glad to see them. All three brothers returned, all intact, all alive and well. There was joy in the hearts of the people as they saw them riding across the countryside back towards the castle, where their father lay on a bed of pain, still alive but barely. Like the last seconds of a day, like the last light of a sun going down, he was on that bed of pain, surrounded by medicines that were doing no good. It was the youngest son who went in first. Filled with joy, he entered that royal bedroom, and he went down to his father and said, "Father, I have found the water of life. Drink this, it will heal you." And his father, in the mystery of his own feverish self, he took that vial and he drank down that water and he spit it out. "Oh, that's horrible," he said, and his face turned green and his fever climbed up his bones. "Get out of my sight. You're trying to kill me. Get out, get out." And the youngest son left, feeling scared and confused. And then the two older brothers stepped into the royal bedroom. And they went to their father's bedside as well. And they said, "Father, we don't know what your youngest son was up to, but we suspect he was up to no good. For we are the ones who have found the water of life. Here, this is it. Drink this. It will heal you." And he drank down that water of life. And immediately it filled his bones. It made him flourish in a deep way. And his fever left him like a tired wind leaving through the gate of a barnyard. And he sighed a deep sigh of contentment. And he began to sleep, a deep and healing sleep. All the wise men and wise women gathered around were amazed. He hadn't slept this well in a long time. And then, with satisfied hearts, the two older brothers left the royal bedroom. Outside in a hallway they found the youngest son. They went to him and they said, "You little twerp, we switched the waters on you, didn't we? Because we're clever and you were not, because you were dumb, dumb, dumb. And if you squeak about this to anyone, it will be the last squeaking you ever do." And so the youngest son went off, feeling very scared. Well, that king slept all night, and the next day he sat up in bed. And that night he slept again, and the next day after that he stood up and he walked around. And after one more day of fantastic, beautiful, healing sleep, he got up and got on a horse, and he rode around his kingdom. Not only was he healed, but he seemed younger than he'd been before. The gray had gone from his hair. He was flourishing like a new flower jumping out of the earth. The people were amazed. The wise men and the wise women were amazed. The lords and ministers were amazed at the king's miraculous recovery. And so perhaps this story is over. We began with a sick king, and that king is now healed. But somewhere in your big toe or in your elbow, in some part of your body or your mind or your awareness, you might feel that things are not quite finished. The dance, the equation, the poem of this story is not quite over. All seemed well, but the two older brothers continued to mutter and tell stories to their father. "We're not sure about that youngest son of yours, you know. Our brother, he's got some strange ideas. He's got some evil ideas, we might say. We don't want to draw any conclusions, but we're thinking he might have designs on your throne, father. We don't want to tell you what to do, but perhaps you better be careful around him." So they muttered these stories to him every day, and slowly, like a medicine, they took effect. And then there came a day when, with a heavy heart, the old king summoned his royal huntsman to the throne room, a man who'd been with the family for a long, long time. He taught all of the king's sons about the forest, and about the animals and the butterflies and the winds and the rivers of that place. And the king summoned him to his side and said, "My friend, you old huntsman, I have a task for you to accomplish. It is a difficult task. Take my youngest son on a hunting expedition, but this is an expedition from which he will not return. I want you to go to the forest and kill my youngest son, but make it look like an accident." So the old huntsman, who was a clever and a secretive man, heard these words and said, "I will do this, O king. I will do this, your majesty." And so a few days later, he invited the youngest son out on a hunting expedition, and out they went into the wilds of that forest. But as they went, the youngest son could tell that there was a deep sorrow in the heart of the old huntsman. He saw this sorrow. He felt it in the air and in his face. And not only that, he was confident enough to speak about it. And he said, "My friend, old huntsman, tell me, what is troubling your heart?" And he said, "I want to tell you, but I should not. Please tell me your trouble, and we will solve this together." So the old huntsman said, "The king, your father, has ordered me to kill you in this forest, and to make it look like an accident." Well, the youngest son did not wail, he did not cry. He simply said, in a calm voice, he said, "Give me your clothes, and I will give you mine. You go back to the king, and convince him that I have been killed. As for me, I will vanish into the wilderness. As for me, I will disappear." So the old huntsman went back to the king, and being a clever man, he was able to convince him that he had killed his youngest son. And the youngest son disappeared from this story. He followed a path of ashes and of silence, of crow feather wisdom and dark, secret things. He disappeared. And all was well in the castle, so it seemed. The king was healthy. The two older brothers were there. All seemed to be humming along like a beautiful clock. And then one day a new sound entered the kingdom. And this sound was a squeaking sound. At the edge of the kingdom, a farmer heard it. He was in his field, and he heard a squeaking sound coming from behind a hill. And he stood up, and he looked, and there was a wagon approaching. A wagon that was brightly painted, purple and gold and green, beautiful colors. But as the wagon approached, with a man on it and 2 horses pulling it, the farmer noticed this wagon had actually seen some troubled times. It was a worn-down, almost broken wagon, but it did have a new coat of paint. And it was loaded high with gifts for the king and the queen and the youngest son in that castle. The farmer watched it go squeaking along the dusty road and then over the hill. And before long this wagon arrived at the castle. Before long those gifts were brought to the throne room and set up in that room. A statue of a monkey made out of turquoise. Arrows, spears, shields, magic books, atlases of the ancient world, silks and magical gowns, all kinds of fantastic things were brought into that throne room. The king and the queen marveled at these gifts. And the man driving the wagon said, "These are gifts from a kingdom that has been greatly helped by your youngest son." And then the wagon and the man riding it turned around and went away. Well, the king wondered at these gifts. And then before long there was another squeaking sound, and there was another wagon approaching that kingdom. And it too was loaded high with gifts for the king and the queen and the youngest son. These gifts were also unloaded in the throne room. A jade mountain statue, amulets of all kinds, tarot cards in special bronze boxes, statues of this and of that, magical foods, all kinds of things were given there. And then that wagon too went away. And finally a third wagon arrived, and by the time that wagon had squeaked away across the dusty roads and departed from that kingdom, by the time that happened, the king was a troubled man. And the huntsman noticed this, and went to him, and spoke, and said, "Your Majesty, what is troubling you?" And the king said, "I fear I have made a great mistake. I fear that it was a terrible thing I asked you to do, to kill my youngest son. For perhaps he had good in his heart after all." And the huntsman said, "Sire, I have news which I hope will delight you. For I did not have the heart to kill your youngest son." And he explained to him how they had exchanged clothes, and the youngest son had vanished into the wilderness. The king was overjoyed. He sent his messengers to all corners of that kingdom with the news that the youngest son was pardoned. He could come home at any time. "Come home, we are desirous of your company." So these messengers went out into the world. Now time was passing, and in fact, almost an entire year had passed since the youngest son entered the castle of the Water of Life. And he knew this, and his brothers knew this, for they had remembered every detail told to them by their youngest brother. So the oldest son put on his nice, beautiful clothes, and he got on a good, strong horse, and he began to ride out into the forest towards the castle of the Water of Life. But that castle had changed as well. For the princess in that castle had given orders to all her workmen and all her servants to build a golden road leading up to that castle. So they had done this. And now, before the gate of that castle, there was a shining, glimmering road made of gold, that metal which does not tarnish and does not age, that metal which seems to be a small piece of the eternal. It shone in the sun, it shone in the moonlight. It was a beautiful and golden road. And not only had she done this, but she had given instructions to the guards at the gate of that castle. And she had told them, if a man should come, if a young man should come, riding on the left or the right side of this golden road, do not let that man enter, turn him away. But if a young prince should come, riding down the middle of this road, then that is the man of my heart. That is the man that I will marry. So open the gates and let him in. So the day came, and early in the morning the oldest son rode on a beautiful horse, dressed in magnificent garments. He rode towards that castle. And he came to that meadow where the grasses were long and whispered around you as you walked through them. And he approached that castle that seemed to be made out of smashed moonlight, and he saw that golden road. And when he did, there was a thought in his head, and it was this: money. That is an expensive road. When I am king of this castle, I will rip up that road and sell those bricks of gold. That is no way to treat gold. Anyone can walk on it. The hooves of horses can dirty it up, scratch it up, make it lose its value. I'm going to take care of this road. And so he took his horse and rode up the left side of that golden road. And then he came to the gate of that castle. And the guards looked at him and they said, "You, sir, are in the wrong place. You, sir, must turn around. Please turn your horse around and go." So the oldest son did this. He was confused. He'd never really been treated this way before. So he wandered off into the forest. Well, the middle son had also prepared for this day. He was wearing beautiful clothes as well. He was riding a stupendous, strong, and beautiful horse. And he also followed the directions he remembered from his younger brother. And he came to that meadow filled with long, whispering grass. And he approached the castle that seemed to be made of smashed moonlight. And he too saw that road. And he thought to himself, wow, that is an expensive road. I do not want to mess that road up. They might be angry with me, because that is worth a lot of money. So he turned his horse to the side and rode up the right side alongside that road. And he came to the gate of that castle. And the guards looked at him and they said, "You, sir, must turn around. This is not the place for you. You do not belong here. Turn your horse around and gallop away." So the middle son did this. He also felt confused. He had never quite been rejected in exactly this way. But in the trees of that forest, there was the youngest son. He was also riding his horse, which was not as magnificent or beautiful as those of his brothers. And as he rode, he was thinking about the princess in that castle. He was remembering how it had felt to have her squeeze his hands. He was wondering about that whole situation, the magic water, the golden bed, the princess there, to be king and to be queen of that realm. What is that? What does that mean? And he remembered the light in her eyes and the laughter hidden inside her voice. And then he looked up and he was at the gate of the castle. He had not even seen the golden road. And the two guards said, "Come in, sir. This is the place for you. You are the one we have been waiting for a long time." And the gates of the castle swung open, and the princess was there, and he got off his horse, and she welcomed him. "Welcome to this place. Welcome to this castle. We are so glad that you have come." And she welcomed him, and they had a delicious feast together. And they spent some time in that castle getting to know each other. Time moved forward. Days became weeks. And after a while, it was decided that the two of them would be married. So there was a beautiful ceremony. There was a purple tent put out on the grass. There were musicians. There was fantastic wine brought up from the basement of that castle. Traveling people came. People came from all corners of that kingdom. And they celebrated the marriage of the princess of the castle of the water of life and the youngest son from the distant kingdom filled with stone. And when that ceremony was over, there was a beautiful festival. There was a feast. They roasted a pig. They roasted an ox. There was wine of all kinds. There was laughter. There were bards from Uzbekistan singing long legends in which horses become angels and then become clouds and come to earth as rain to give gifts to the people. There were fantastic things. People fell in love at this party. People fell in love. They fell out of love and they fell back into love again. There was sorrow and joy and dancing till the wee hours of the night. And in the middle of this party, a messenger came in, And he told his message to all those who would hear, and it was, "The youngest son of our kingdom is welcome back. The king is seeking him. He is fully pardoned. He is desirous of his company." So the next day, when everyone was recovering from this beautiful and magnificent party, that message reached the ears of the princess and of the youngest son. He took this news deep into his heart, and it was like a warm and beautiful wine that nourished him. And about a week later, he said to his wife, the princess, "You know, my dear, I believe it's time for me to return to the castle of my birth and to visit my father, just for a little while." And she said, "Yes, I think it is right for you to do that." So he got on his horse, and he rode away from the castle of the Water of Life. And so he traveled through that forest, connecting once again these two realms, the kingdom of stone and the kingdom of water, joining them by the desires in his heart and by the galloping and the movements of his horse. So he went through the landscapes of this world, across the forests and the fields, and finally he returned to the kingdom where he was born. Finally he returned to the castle in which he was born. And he got off his horse, and the guards greeted him at the door, and they were very glad to see him. And he said to them, "Tell me, my dear guards of this castle, what has happened to my brothers? Have they been seen around these places?" And they said, "It's funny you should ask. For not long ago, the two of them got on a boat and set sail across the sea. No one has heard a word about them or their whereabouts." So the youngest son entered that castle, and he walked through the hallways to the throne room, and there was his father. And his father welcomed him with open arms and with an open heart. And then the two of them went to the palace garden, and they sat down beside a fountain in that garden. And the youngest son told his father all about his quest to find the water of life. What is betrayal for? What does it have to teach us? In our journey through this life, as we learn and hopefully grow, that is something we encounter, something I've encountered, perhaps you've encountered as well. And it happens in this story in a heavy way in this second half of this story. The youngest son, who is innocent and who tells everything to his brothers, he trusts them completely, is betrayed by them. And this leads, of course, to his father giving an order to have him killed, and the youngest son's exile from the kingdom. So this is a darker road for the youngest son to travel in this part of the story. And there is more trouble and suffering, perhaps, in this story, in this part of the story. The first half had a lot of suffering of the realm. The king was sick. The realm was stuck. The older brothers get stuck in their ways and locked in stone. And the youngest son had some moments of victory, really, to get into the castle and get out again. Now, however, we see how his innocence and his lack of arrogance, which served him so well in the first part of the story, get him into trouble in this part of the story. Which seems only right. I mean, in the first part of the story, his openness was a characteristic which took him a long way. The others would not listen to the dwarf. They would not listen to the low-down, hairy voice at the bottom of their world. But the youngest son would. He was open to that. He was not arrogant. He was in touch with the fact that he was actually lost and had no idea where to find the water of life. So he was very open to what the dwarf had to say, open to new opportunities. But now in the second half, that openness gets him into trouble. He meets his brothers and he is open with them. He tells them everything that has happened. He trusts them completely. And that is not the right thing to do. Or perhaps if he wants to grow as a human, it is the right thing to do because it gets him into trouble. And trouble is one of the ways by which we learn, of course. I'm someone who, when I see someone waving from a car and I'm walking on the side of the road, I tend to wave back, not really thinking that the person might not be waving to me. So I've got some experience with innocence, you might say. Who among us does not? Luckily, hopefully, we're born that way. And we get to be innocent for some time, but then the lesson comes. Then the teaching comes. We see the underside of things. The poet Sherman Alexie has that wonderful short little poem that I read years ago. And it goes something like this. When I crawled underneath the HUD house to fix the plumbing, I learned something about America. Sherman Alexie, a Native American, climbing under his house to fix the plumbing, under the house he lived in, which is a HUD house, government money and the federal money was used to build that house. And he goes to fix the plumbing, and he finds out that that plumbing is not done very well. So I would guess from this poem. And so then he learns something about power and that the federal government does not actually care about his house as much as he might have thought it did. When I climbed under the HUD house to fix the plumbing, I learned something about America. So that in that poem is a moment of learning. It's a wake-up call, and it's a betrayal. If perhaps he had thought that America was looking out for him, if the federal government, the HUD people were looking out for him and his family, that's a moment where he learned that was not true. This kind of thing goes very deep. It happens on the schoolyard. I remember having friends in third grade that I thought were my friends forever, and then they got other friends and went off. And this says less about them than perhaps about me and where I was at in my belief that we would be friends forever, and we were not actually friends forever. That's life. That's the way it happens. We get kicked around a little bit, and that kicking around is painful, but perhaps necessary. I can say that. I'm not sure I completely believe it in my heart, even though it makes sense, but it must be true. And in this story, that's the kind of education the youngest son gets. So one way into this story, for us listening to it, is to ask ourselves, when were we betrayed? When did things not turn out as we thought? When was our youthful, innocent vision of the world broken to be replaced by something a little more true and a little more harsh? It is a bitter pill to swallow. But hopefully, when taken into the soul, when taken into your intelligence and your heart and your understanding, it can lead to growth and not simply to anger or strange, rash acts. In this story, it leads to a certain inwardness. The youngest son leaves the kingdom. He goes away, and perhaps he learns something in that time. I love that we don't know exactly what he does. I can imagine what he does, but it doesn't spell it out. He leaves the story. He leaves the kingdom of that story for a while, only to return later. So this is a big, beautiful subject, betrayal. Beautiful like a dark sky can be beautiful. Like a dark sky filled with storm clouds can be beautiful. I would just add that, of course, betrayal can happen personally, and it can happen on a national level. Your image of where you live, for example, can be changed by Vietnam, for example. By the Gulf War, for me, when I was in college, that happened, and I was like, whoa, things aren't as I thought they were. And these things cut very deep, and we learn from them. So perhaps you can think of moments in your own life of betrayal, and you can find them rhyming in some way with the details of this story. And then we get this wonderful test of the Golden Road, this test which the older brothers fail. And again, it's interesting, they're the arrogant ones. They're the ones who know what to do, who ride on the fastest horses and go straight and strong towards their goal. But here, they decide to turn away and go to the side, which seems uncharacteristic of them. But this is really a test of what do you value. It's a test to see, do you value money and gold? Is that the biggest thing on your mind or not? And the people that come to that castle thinking only of the gold will fail the test. If you were to ask me where I find myself in this story, where I wake up from the dream of my life to find myself in the landscape of this story, I would say it's the moment when the youngest son puts on the old hunter's clothes and disappears into the forest. It even feels wrong to call him the youngest son. It's more like, I would say it's the moment when I put on the old hunter's clothes and disappear into the forest. I've had enough of the realm of castles and power because it did me wrong. And I just want to head out into the wild where I can study the moss under the trees and learn from shadows and from silence. That's a sign, I suppose, that I see myself in that part of the story because it feels right to say I am there, not to talk about it in a distanced way, as if it were happening to the youngest son, because it feels like it's happening to me. So I don't know how much help that is to you, but perhaps you can find yourself in this story as well. You can remember it and see where it feels most appropriate to say, I do this. I ride on the boat across the sea. I'm the one who feeds the lions. I'm the one who listens to the dwarf. I'm the one who ignores the dwarf and keeps galloping towards those mountains in the distance that finally will catch me. I am the one who stole the magic water from my brothers. I am the one who waits in the castle for the strange man to come. I am the one who welcomes him by squeezing his hands. I am the one in touch with water and with silence and with magic, hoping for somebody from that realm to come. I am the one dying on the bed in the royal bedroom. I invite you to find your way into this story. Thank you for listening to this podcast. There are more stories on my website, jayleeming.com, jayleeming.com. And please send me your comments there if you'd like. I'd love to know how you feel about this story and where you find yourself in it. Thanks to those who've been able to support this podcast. You can do that through Patreon. That helps keep this thing going. Hooray, hooray. Thank you. And take care. And may we all learn to balance these elements of water and of stone. All the best.